Thank you so much. Good morning from Los Angeles, California. My name is Timothy Doran, and I shall be discussing Spartan eugenics as ideology and practice. In a broad definition, economics can be defined as the way a society reproduces itself. Less broadly, economics may be seen as the way scarce resources are produced, distributed, and consumed. The most basic form of production is, of course, reproduction. The scarce resources that I shall discuss here are heritable human traits that the Spartiates found valuable and whose distribution they saw as crucial to their community. Unless we believe that ancient attestations of directed reproduction amongst the Spartiates are only part of a Spartan mirage, it is clear that the Spartiates practiced eugenics with the goal of breeding stronger, more enduring, and braver soldiers. This talk intends to analyze evidence for Spartiate eugenics and concludes that a fascination with eugenics was indeed present in Spartiate culture. The practice of directed human reproduction or eugenics indeed existed among the Spartiates, and some of the discomfort that surrounds the topic is misplaced. The following is meant to introduce a book on Spartan eugenics for which I have a contract with Palgrave Macmillan to appear around 2026. Xenophon's attestations of Spartan reproductive customs describe cultural norms preventing some individuals from contributing and granting other persons additional reproductive opportunities. This seems an ideology and practice of directed human reproduction, in other words, eugenics. It has garnered little scholarly attention. There are three main reasons why. First, the subject of eugenics and the very word itself often arouses distress, summoning images of the misappropriation of Darwin's insights about heredity to justify discrimination, the forced sterilization of persons classified as disabled, forced euthanasia, racism, and Nazism. Hitler admired Sparta or his vision of it, yet an ancient Peloponnesian city-state should not be blamed for a regime occurring some 2,500 years later. Further, my own library of antique books with the word eugenics in their titles have little to no racial content and no recommendations of forced euthanasia. In these books, eugenics literally means good birthing or sound breeding. These books exhort practices that were believed to be likely to produce healthy children. Mate choice is emphasized with rejection of drunks, syphilitics, and lazy people, and praise of good marriage practices, sound child rearing, and nutrition. Second, the practice itself of selective breeding of humans for specific traits may be regarded by some persons as impossible. Clearly, dog breeding, which relies on selective manipulations of inputs, has been successful in creating dog breeds as different as pit bulls and poodles. But dog generations are short and human generations very long. Yet if we view Spartiate eugenics as an ideology, it then becomes an aspect of Spartan intellectual history and thus a fair object of cultural historical study. It is not claimed here that these biological interventions were effective, only that they were part of the Spartan idea of their own genos, their own bloodline. Moreover, while a change in the overall Spartiate population would be impossible without extremely stringent breeding restrictions over many thousands of years, nevertheless, the offspring of selected pair bonds may well have been more likely to carry favorable characteristics. Hence, this grand attempt may have produced modest results on a tiny couple-by-couple scale. A third reason why eyebrows are raised at this topic is the cloud of skepticism around many Spartan topics over the past century, the belief in something called the Spartan mirage. Like Paul Reha, who spoke last night, I agree that the term Spartan mirage deserves retirement. I've discussed this in chapter 2 of my monograph, Spartan Oliganthropia. My method as a historian is to examine what is stated as a Spartan practice or action in a reasonably reliable ancient source, to assume that unless countervailing evidence exists, at least the core of it is probably true, and to spend my time trying to analyze how this would be likely to affect society on the ground. We move to hereditarian thought and practices that we may define as eugenic. These have existed far longer than the modern term eugenics, hence far longer than the 19th and 20th centuries. For although the term eugenics was made popular by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in the 1880s, basic ideas of directing human reproduction with the goal of producing offspring possessing desired characteristics probably started at the same time that heredity began to be understood. probably by the Neolithic, when humans engaged in selective breeding of plants and animals to produce individuals and lineages more docile or having longer strands of hair or fiber for textiles, or larger fruits or other desired characteristics. It has never required an understanding of molecular level mechanics of heredity to notice that if two individuals who possess particular characteristics mate, their offspring will tend to possess those characteristics. Interests in human heredity were not foreign to Greek thinkers. Theognis of Megara complains, for example, that aristocratic families are muddying their genea, their lineages, by intermarrying with persons considered low. The language is clearly biological and reproductive, and Charles Darwin even referenced theognis in 1871. Eugenic thinking famously appears in Plato's Republic, also in his Theaetetus. In the latter, Plato presents midwives as, quote, being all-knowing concerning what kind of woman should have intercourse with what kind of man to produce the best children, unquote. This indicates hereditarian or eugenic ideas amongst Greeks of his time. Aristotle's own notions of what constituted eugeneia, or good birth, are given forth in the fragmentary dialogue peri-eugeneias. True eugeneia, he argues, is located in one's genos, that is, in the fineness of one's ancestry, not in one's wealth. A most dramatic form of eugenics is the infanticide described in the later author Plutarch, who in Life of Lycurgus 16.2 writes, "The father was not authorized to rear the offspring, but he took it to a place called the Lesche, in which the elders of the tribe, sitting in council, examined the infant. And if it was well put together and strong, they ordered that he raise it, and assigned a kleros to it from the 9,000. But if it was agenes kai amorphon, low-born and impaired, it was sent to the so-called apothetai, a chasm near Taygetos, on the grounds that it was better neither for itself nor for the polis for it to live from the start, not born finely in terms of health and strength." Some argue that since King Agesilaus II was born with a limp and was short, yet was not disposed of at birth, this must mean that Spartans had no nomos stipulating the disposal of such infants. However, several arguments militate against this. Agesilaus may have acquired the limp through an accident rather than being born with it. Even if born with a limp, it may have been unnoticeable in a baby too young to crawl, and shortness can often only manifest long after birth. Additionally, Agesilaus was born only a couple of decades after the most deadly earthquake of the mid-460s. This could have loosened any rules about exposing impaired infants. Finally, he was not a Spartiate per se, but a royal, for whom the exposure rules were probably different. Even aside from infanticide, we must still label many Spartan practices as eugenic. Xenophon's Politeia of the Lacedaemonians tells us much about these. Xenophon's status as cavalryman and horse raiser allowed him to analyze the reproductive customs of Spartan society as a system of selective breeding, which, in his view, created a population phenotypically different from surrounding Greek societies. He starts his account with technopoieia, the production of offspring. Spartiate girls receive more food than girls do in other Greek states. The Spartan regime encouraged the athletic training of girls and women for physical strength and emphasized nutrition for developing fetuses, which is a medically and eugenically sound thing to do. The fact that the young women competed against each other in athletic contests suggests that the winners gained respect, and thus perhaps they improved their chances of attracting a quality husband and, by extension, their reproductive opportunities. The stipulation that a Spartan man must marry before he gets old, that Xenophon states, carries eugenic consequences as well. Under this nomos, fathers have more opportunity to invest in their offspring than if they marry late and die when their offspring are still children, and they can be present for the active care of their grandchildren, hence guarding and caring for their bloodlines. The notorious practice stating that a husband may introduce to his wife another Spartiate for reproductive sexual intercourse has inspired a range of interpretations. Significantly, Xenophon says that the husband did this only if he admired the body and soul of another man. Hopoiou andros somate kai psychen agasteye. Please pardon my ancient Greek pronunciation. I was taught to speak to pronounce ancient Greek words in a particular way in college. Clearly, the practice selects for physically strong, well-formed, courageous, and attractive men, soma type psyche. Similarly, Xenophon says that any good man could have children by another man's wife if her husband approved, providing the first man was genaios, meaning well-bred, certainly in its context a eugenic term. Xenophon also uses genaios to mean well-bred in his Chiropaideia 1.4.15 in a discussion of animals. And Xenophon concludes on the subject, quote, anyone can decide for himself whether men in Sparta differ from others in terms of size, megathos, and strength, ischus, unquote. In section 2 of the treatise, Xenophon describes the paideia for Spartiate boys. Boys are trained by a paidonomos who furnishes physical punishments for improper behavior. The boys are hardened, including their feet, prepared for both cold and heat, given lean rations as to become accustomed to hard exertion without needing to eat much, and given the sorts of food. Long marches through hostile terrain surely produced conditions of privation. This diet further seems intended to weed out individuals with inefficient metabolisms or genetic proneness to obesity. At the end of section 5, echoing again 1 and 2, Xenophon states once more that all this restraint and sifting has made the Spartiates look different from other peoples. He writes, for someone could not easily find persons healthier nor more capable with their bodies than the Spartiates. The intention seems that the individuals who flourish under these restrictions would be the ones best able to tolerate them. In theory, if this hard regime continued for many generations, the traits responsible for strength and metabolic efficiency would remain and increase in frequency in the breeding pool. Yet we would need vastly more generations than existed in archaic and classical Sparta to effect actual population level changes in human bodies. Again, in reality, perhaps we'd see a few families possessing certain phenotypic traits in slightly more frequency that looked as though they resulted from selective breeding. The identification of losers and winners seems the goal of the system. The mechanisms work as follows. In section 4.2, Xenophon says that Lycurgus, quote, believed that if he could match the young men together in competition for excellence, in this way they would reach the peak of bravery. Conformity to these principles occurs in the selection of the Hippes, who despite their name are an elite infantry group in Sparta. The ephors pick out 3 men in their prime, akmadzontai, known as the Hipp Agratai. These 3 men pick out 100 men, rejecting those outside the 100 and giving reasons for their acceptance and their rejections. The rejected men keep watch on the selected men in order to be able to expose them for any lapses of honor. This creates eris or strife, says Xenophon, in a mode reminiscent of the 2 kinds of strife in the city. There is a harmful one, but also a useful one that encourages men to better themselves through competition. Presumably the winners reproduce more as well, for they receive the best marriage options. And they are the ones selected for their soma and psyche by other males to impregnate their wives. Status in most societies correlates with wealth, and generally in pre-industrial demographic regimes, the wealthy reproduce more, and when they do not reproduce more, they have more resources to invest in the offspring that they do produce. They are also most able to indulge in what Walter Scheidel calls marginal reproductive success in ostensibly monogamous societies. That is, reproduction with prostitutes, concubines, slaves, and impoverished women. And in the case of the Spartiates, these women would include perioikoi, helots, and most importantly, the wives of their comrades who ask them to, without chipping away at any inheritance. Conversely, the penalties attached to failure are immense and bear negative reproductive outcomes. Small-scale failure at living up to Spartiate ideals incurs moderate humiliation, presumably tending to stimulate the desire to succeed. But the penalties for repeated or severe failure are most unpleasant, including deeper humiliation, physical harm, and worse. The persons labeled as kakoi, meaning cowards or perhaps just low-quality men, are disrespected, shunned, and must step out of the way of young men in the street. They are beaten by their betters, another harsh penalty for not living up to the requirements of the society. Such exclusion debars a man like this from magistracies, which Millender convincingly argues were occupied by a wide range of Spartiates. Xenophon writes of the Spartiates classified as kakoi in section 9.5 of the Politeia of the Lacedaemonians. This is my translation. He must feed his unmarried female relatives at home and supply the reason as to why these women are not married. And he must suffer a hearth without a wife and at the same time pay a penalty for that, and must not stroll about at ease nor imitate the blameless, or he must submit to blows from better men. With such dishonor piled upon these kakoi, instead of a thusly dishonored or disgraced life, I am not surprised at the choice to die. Here, suicide seems the message, a permanent removal from the breeding pool. If true, then the efficiency of Spartiate social shame in pursuit of eugenic effects would barely require state murder of infants. Further, these men's sisters seem to not be allowed to marry. They then are also removed from the breeding pool. I would argue that this detail strongly supports a hereditary and eugenic rationale behind the punishment. The poetry of the archaic Spartan poet Tertius, especially the first half of the poem 10, describing the terrible life of a deserter in exile, supports this strikingly. This suggests that the system Xenophon describes stretches back at least to Tertius's time, the 7th century. And unless Tertius created this cultural system, he only reflected it or elaborated it, and hence it is older than him. The surviving undesirables mentioned here largely drop out of the breeding pool by no longer becoming actively involved in reproduction, at least not with Spartiate wives. The hereditary logic, the intended goal seems to be that if this process continued for sufficient generations, it would contribute to the reduction of certain undesirable hereditary characteristics from the Spartiate genos. The process would theoretically work alongside the exposure of disabled infants. If any of these disgraced men remained in Sparta, it may be they who helped to fill the ranks of what are referred to by Xenophon in his Hellenica as the inferiors or hupomeones. For they are no longer reckoned among the homoioi, as the Politeia of the Lacedaemonians 10.7 says. Hence, to conclude, Xenophon's Politeia of the Lacedaemonians constitutes a primary text for Spartan eugenics, as it describes in detail how individuals in Sparta who had desired traits were given additional reproductive opportunities outside of marriage, and ones who possessed traits deemed negative were severely reduced in their reproductive opportunities. This is certainly as significant an element of eugenics as Plutarch's description of infanticide, even more so since it entails not only negative eugenics, but positive eugenics. Clearly, Xenophon, as a horse breeder, perceived the Spartan system as a sieve or strainer designed not only to weed out some people from the state, but whether effective or not biologically, also to weed out certain hereditary traits from the genos of the Spartiates. Thank you.